This is Kim Wehle with Simple Politics. Today, my guest is Bonnie Glaser, who is the Senior Director for the China Power Project for the Center for Strategic and International Studies. And I've invited Bonnie today to talk about what regular Americans need to understand about China and its relationship with America. So, Bonnie, thank you so much for coming on today to Simple Politics.
Thanks for having me, Kim.
So I read a piece that you were quoted in The Guardian, I think it was 4 years ago, before Donald Trump took office. And what stood out to me was your statement that there's so much misinformation out there about China. And also, when people ask you, is it a superpower? And I'm paraphrasing, your response is, well, that's not exactly the right question. I wonder if you could sort of clarify for people what is the main thing that people misunderstand about China and that they need to understand about China?
Well, I think there's a lot that people misunderstand about China. Some people think that China actually has the biggest economy in the world now. It's actually still a little bit more than half, maybe two-thirds that of the United States. It is catching up. But the United States had the largest economy in the world in the late 1800s, but really didn't become a world superpower until after World War II. So economic power isn't everything. Technological power matters, of course, military power. So basically, China lags in some areas. It's strong in others. If we look at areas like AI, quantum computing, China has great ambitions to get ahead of the United States and may in some ways be taking a small lead. So really understanding, like breaking down what the areas of power are, where China's strong, where it lags behind, and why it matters. So this is one of the things that I try to do on a website, which we call China Power. It's at chinapower.csis.org, where we ask questions about China, and then we use data to answer them, because we try to be objective and get hard data to tell people about what's going on in China.
So, some people say that China is a threat to the United States. That is, it's an area of the world that we need to be concerned about. And I say that because it seems like over the past 4 years under the Trump administration, there was a lot of national focus, media focus on Russia. I wonder if you could weigh in on that idea that, whoa, China is the country to worry about. And if so, why?
Well, if you define threat as a military threat to the continental United States, then we don't have to be very worried about China. China doesn't really have the intention to attack the United States. When we think about the word threat, we usually define it as capabilities plus intent. So China has capabilities, it has nuclear weapons, but it doesn't have the intent to attack the United States. But if we think about the word threat more broadly, threat to American interests globally, then frankly, I think we do have to worry about China. And there's a lot of areas. So China considers, for example, US alliances, whether they be alliances with Japan, Australia, the Philippines, Thailand. These are our allies and Korea. These are our 5 allies that exist in East Asia. Of course, we also have allies in Europe, but the Chinese are worried about the alliances in Asia. They call them Cold War relics. They think they should just go away, that we should abandon them. And these alliances are very important to the United States. China steals intellectual property, and it steals a lot of it. It's put a lot of companies out of business. In fact, in 2015, Chinese leader Xi Jinping signed an agreement with then President Obama, saying that China would stop using cyber to steal intellectual property for commercial advantage. But it really hasn't carried through on that promise. Then we have the threat of disinformation. And this is really important around the pandemic. because when COVID-19 first started, the Chinese didn't want to be blamed for starting the pandemic. It did, we think, all evidence points to the fact that it started in China, but the Chinese was sending around tweets and other messages on other social media saying that maybe the US military brought COVID-19 to China, because we had actually a 100-person delegation from the US Army visit Wuhan, which is where COVID-19 emerged. And that's, the Chinese just said, well, the US probably brought it there. And now we see actually disinformation where the Chinese are amplifying a Russian message that Western vaccines are dangerous. I think they like the fact that Americans are dying and that we are mired in this pandemic. It's damaging our economy. And so they're trying to tell Americans, as the Russians are, that Americans just should be afraid of our vaccine. There's no data to support this, of course. And then we have things like Chinese efforts to undermine widely accepted norms on human rights in the United Nations, saying human rights should just be economic development. If you give people food and clothing, then they have human rights, but they shouldn't necessarily have the right to speak or to protest or voice their own views. And then the Chinese have been increasingly using economic coercion against other countries. So the biggest target right now is Australia. There's about a dozen Australian products that the Chinese are boycotting. So when the US decides to punish a country because they're violating, let's say, our Iran sanctions law or something like that, we announce it. We do this in a very transparent way. Countries may not like what we're doing, but that's another story. At least we are transparent and public about it. The Chinese, of course, deny that they're doing any of this, but they have stopped importing Australian coal and barley and wine and lobsters and timber and sugar. It's a long list. So this is really damaging to, particularly, of course, a democracy where you have private companies. In China, most of the really big, successful companies are not necessarily successful, but bigger state-owned enterprises. They're run by the government. There is a private sector, but it's facing more and more challenges because the government prioritizes state-owned enterprises. And then there's, we can talk about how China's undermining some of the international law, bullying Taiwan, which is a democracy, where, there was a civil war between what was then called the Nationalist Party and the Chinese Communist Party. The Chinese Communists won 1949. The Nationalists receded to the island of Taiwan, and Taiwan has never come under the rule or control or administration of the People's Republic of China. But the Chinese claim that they have sovereign rights, and so they bully Taiwan, and they steal Taiwan's diplomatic partners, and they have their military in Taiwan's airspace, around its air defense identification zone every day. So there's a lot of activity that China is engaged in to undermine democracy around the world. China thinks that its model is, its economic and development model is far more successful than that of the United States. So, they say democracy's in the rearview mirror. The phrase in China these days is the East is rising and the West is declining. And this is really, I think, emboldening China to do more to assertively promote its interests. So, under the Trump administration, the United States basically said we are in a strategic competition with China. And the Biden administration has adopted that frame as well. Yes, there are areas we might have common interests with China. We could talk about those. There's a potential for cooperation. But the main frame, the thrust of this relationship is increasingly one of strategic competition.
So take us a little bit into the minds of the Chinese government and the Chinese culture. What do they want? When you say, listen, they don't like our strategic alliances in Asia, they're picking on Australia. What is their overall objective, do you think, as a country? How would they like to see the globe change if they had it their way?
Well, to begin with, China wants countries to defer to Chinese interests and not damage Chinese interests. So when the South Koreans deployed a missile defense system in the capital and said, we're just protecting ourselves against North Korean missiles, the Chinese said, oh, this will have some impact on our nuclear capabilities. So you have to remove this. And the South Koreans said, it's our sovereign right to have this missile defense system. It's defensive. And the Chinese, again, took economic coercive and punitive measures against South Korea. So the number one thing is defer to China, don't damage Chinese interests. Second is respect China. There's a phrase in Asian culture, you give a person face. It means you don't embarrass them or humiliate them. You hold them up and you say positive things about them. So giving them face, saying wonderful things about China. I think that's part of what they want. They really do want respect. But increasingly, under Xi Jinping, the Chinese want more than just this. They want to lead. They want to mold the international order, the international system that was put in place at the end of World War II, which was based on liberal Western norms. They want to revise this system, and they're not totally clear about how. We see some actions that they have already taken, but it's clear China has long said that the international system is not just, it's not reasonable. It doesn't protect China's interests. It advances, they think, the interests of the United States and our democratic partners. So part of it is about like having cyber sovereignty. The Chinese have in place what many people call the Great Firewall. So that prevents many Chinese citizens, unless they have VPNs, from accessing an enormous amount of information from the outside world. A lot of it in English, but also in Chinese that comes from Taiwan is blocked. So the information that the people get in China is also very restricted, and it's only information that makes China look good. And when the Chinese are angry at the Japanese, the only information they'll see about Japan and on the nightly, TV shows or dramas or movies will be a reminder that Japan defeated China in war and it's an enemy. But then, of course, the narrative can change if China wants to improve relations. So this can evolve over time, but it is very much control of information that the Chinese want. They don't want to be forced, of course, to accept any of the freedoms, the norms that exist in the Western world. They want to be able to treat their people any way they want. And this extends to the issue of how they treat ethnic groups. So one of the very prominent issues today is that the Chinese have basically locked up or incarcerated upwards of 1 million Uyghurs. So these are people of a different ethnic groups. They are Muslim. They live in Western China. And in the mid-2000s, the Chinese had some very small incidents that were, it's hard to even call them terrorist incidents, but there was one case, for example, there was a knifing incident in the city of Kunming in China, where some people were killed with some knives, and it was said that the Uyghurs were responsible for that. So the number of people that were killed was probably, I'm just guessing at this point, probably around 10. It was low numbers, but yes, people were killed. And then there was an incident in Beijing with a car bombing, which also a small number of people died. And then there was a fairly large protest that took place in 2009, I think it was, in Xinjiang. And you had some people, there was violence, I think, on both sides, the police and some of the Uyghurs. So the Chinese decided they faced a huge terrorism threat as a result of these small incidents. And they decided to take very draconian measures against the Uyghurs. So they've been rounding up these people, sometimes because they wear beards, because they pray, because they have a prayer carpet, in their home, because they have WhatsApp on their phone, which is not allowed in China. And then they just lock these people up and they call them re-education camps. But there's some people who have come out, growing numbers of them, who are telling their stories. And there are horror stories about women being mistreated, forced birth control, even forced sterilization, people who are living in very unsanitary conditions in these camps, not allowed to see their families, some of them occasionally in solitary confinement. So it is a question of human rights. And in fact, our Secretary of State, Tony Blinken, has said that this is genocide.
And he is due to have a high-level meeting with the Chinese, right, on U.S. soil in Alaska in a few days. Uh, can you tell us what does that look like? What is, if you're advising U.S. diplomats? Again, my sister's worked in China for many years, and she always tells me, "Listen, Kim, it's not like they're not like Americans. The approach culturally is just very different to business." What's at stake for the Secretary of State? Why is this an important meeting if it is?
Well, the Chinese have been strongly urging, even pressuring the United States to have a meeting. They were frustrated, early in the Biden administration. President Biden talked to so many foreign leaders, and Xi Jinping was really far down the list, but they finally had that phone call. But the message that came from, I think, the White House was that we want to get our house in order first, right? We want to rejuvenate the United States. We want to restore our country. We want to strengthen our alliances, and we'll get around to it. We will engage with China, but it's not the highest priority. So we have our Secretary of State and Secretary of Defense going out to the region, to Japan and Korea for meetings. And I think the Chinese just did not like the optics of being passed by. And so the United States did offer to meet with senior Chinese officials, and there will be two of them, the foreign minister and then a member of the Politburo, Yang Jiechi, who's in charge of foreign policy. And so he will meet with our National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan, and our Secretary of State, Tony Blinken, in Anchorage after all of these other meetings take place. And the message that we're sending to the Chinese is we are engaging with you from a position of strength, right? We have changed since the Trump administration. We now have very strong alliances, and we are managing our epidemic. We're getting it under control. We are strengthening our economy. We are roaring back. So that is the message, I think, that we are trying to deliver to the Chinese. But we're also saying we're willing to engage with you where our interests coincide. And there's a lot of interest in the Biden administration in re-engaging with the world on climate change. And China, of course, being the number one emitter of carbon and emissions, it's essential, to get the Chinese involved. The Obama administration did work with China a bit on climate change. So that's one area. We could work on global health and pandemic issues. We could actually jointly manufacture and distribute vaccines, but I think that's probably a bridge too far. It looks like we have more competition there than we have cooperation. We could work together on North Korea. That's an issue where we've also sort of had some overlapping interests in the past, because neither the US nor China would like to see nuclear weapons in North Korea. But at this point, that's probably irreversible, even though we continue to say that we want a denuclearized North Korea. It's very hard to imagine how we're actually going to get there. But if we try to enforce sanctions on North Korea, we're going to need China's help, because China gives so much aid to North Korea. And economically, it's right on China's border. Usually there's a tremendous amount of trade that goes across that border. Since COVID-19, the border has been totally closed, and China is providing some, I think, even more economic assistance than it usually does, because it doesn't want to see instability in North Korea. So those are some of the issues where we could cooperate. But we also have to address the problems in the relationship. And Secretary of State Tony Blinken has already signaled he wants to talk about Xinjiang And let's talk about Hong Kong, where the Chinese promised when they took over Hong Kong in 1997 that they would preserve this one country, two systems formula. Basically, Hong Kong can remain autonomous, different from all other mainland Chinese cities. But there's been a crackdown in the last year in Hong Kong by China that shows that the Chinese just are no longer going to abide by the promises that they made a decade ago. So that'll be on the agenda. This economic coercion I mentioned against Australia, he's also said will be on the agenda. Taiwan will be on the agenda. So, it's a big list of things that they're going to talk about. My guess is, it's the first meeting. There'll probably be mostly exchange of positions and talking points, and both sides will come out and make a statement or release a, readout. It'll probably look very different. You read one and you say, I wonder, were they at the same meeting? Because the Chinese will want to play up cooperation, and the Biden administration will want to show that it's being tough on China. 9 out of 10 Americans today have a negative opinion of China. And Congress is more anti-China than ever before. So actually, the Biden administration sort of feels a little bit of heat, right? I mean, they actually might be accused of being soft if they were to lead with cooperation with China. So I think they have an interesting balancing game here.
So just to put these things in buckets, it sounds like we have strategic interests that align with China in terms of minimizing North Korea's access to nuclear weapons. Maybe we have a strategic alliance in getting some of these health issues under control. On the other hand, sounds like they like to bash America around the COVID-19 virus and vaccines. Do we have a strategic alliance around or interests together around climate change? Because that's obviously a big thing. And between America and China, we're the two biggest polluters. It seems like, this is a big issue, not just for Joe Biden, but for many Americans, younger Americans, people, 25 and younger. This is really something they care about. They know they're inheriting this. Is there any way we can get on top of this without China's buy-in? And are they invested in seeing climate change addressed?
Well, first and foremost, Xi Jinping wants to be seen as part of the solution, not part of the problem on this issue. And so Xi Jinping spoke at the UN last fall, and he said he committed that China will be carbon neutral by 2060. Now, most of Europe and also now the United States is committing to be carbon neutral by 2050. The Chinese want another 10 years, but it would be good if they start to put in place policies today that would get them there. So yes, they have an interest in being seen as cooperative. There isn't a lot of pressure in China except on the issue of air pollution. Air pollution has been a political issue in China. It's improved in recent years. A decade ago, the air was truly toxic. And there have been times I've visited China where I've worn, a mask to prevent really getting sort of, my lungs infected. People who live there have a much higher incidence of asthma and other lung-related diseases. So, and young children are particularly vulnerable to this. And of course, it doesn't matter how rich you are, you breathe the same air. So this has been a political issue, I think, for China, and it's been a priority. One of the great stories one of my friends told me years ago is we had an American diplomat. I forget what year this was, but it's probably about 2 decades ago, maybe a little bit less, that decided that a good thing to do would be to put an instrument on the top of the US Embassy and measure the particulates in the air and make it public. And they put it out publicly on the internet. And that a lot of people started looking at it, and the Chinese realized that they were not being transparent about this and that they had to catch up so that they wouldn't look badly in front of the eyes of their people. So they started doing the same thing. And now if you go to China today, in virtually every city, you'll find there's an app where you can read a live reading that will take place. There's about 4 different places in Beijing, because it's a very big city, that will give you the real-time measure of certain aspects of the air, and particularly these 2.5 millimeter particulates. So China has responded to the issue of air pollution. Coal is a huge problem in China. It's created an enormous amount of pollution in the air. But it's not only a problem in China, because China has this global project called the Belt and Road Initiative.
I was going to ask you about that. What is that? And
Right. It's well, they started out with the One Belt, One Road. They renamed it the Belt and Road Initiative, and they're promoting connectivity and infrastructure building around the world. And some of that, those projects are coal refining projects. So there's a lot of pollution that's being produced outside China by Chinese firms, but China doesn't really see it as China's responsibility.
so this is sort of a coalition to expand Chinese corporate interests in various parts of the world, this Belt and
So
Road. And is that a concern for America that this initiative is expanding?
well, I think, to be objective, there is an enormous demand around the world for infrastructure, roads, rail, ports, and the United States does not do that kind of financing. Japan does to some extent. They have an Asian Development Bank, and they do invest in those kinds of projects. But the United States really doesn't do infrastructure. And so for China, this is a great idea. Many of these projects, I think, really started before the announcement of the Belt and Road Initiative, and then were sort of brought into it. But I think China's view is there will be all these roads and rails and ports, and they'll all connect to China. So China will be at the center of the world, and the world will be more dependent on China. But we can't ignore the fact that they are providing what countries demand. And when the United States under the Trump administration told countries, you should not be taking funding from China, many of these countries said, so where's the alternative?
Right.
And there isn't an alternative. So the US has tried to work with Japan, with Australia, to provide alternatives, but dollar for dollar, we're just not going to be able to compete. And Chinese influence through these projects will definitely continue.
Right. So Chinese influence is expanding by virtue of these economic relationships,
Yes.
and which maybe is problematic in terms of this sort of superpower mantra, however you want to define it. But I want to get back to what you said earlier around democracy, because some experts have said that sort of democracy globally is slipping. And of course, we know Vladimir Putin, Russia isn't so interested in democracy. His regime, another quote superpower historically, is interested in sort of gleefully seeing American democracy slip. I'm a constitutional law scholar. We've seen it slip 4 years with Donald Trump. Are we, in a bad space in terms of preserving democracy vis-a-vis China after 4 years of Trump, and given what's happening globally? I mean, to me, that's the red flag in this conversation that I don't know people have really heard articulated.
I think you're absolutely right. You can look at Freedom House numbers or other measures of democracy around the world, and there's no doubt that democracy is losing ground. And even in countries that democracy was very fragile, the latest example would be like Myanmar, where there's now been a coup, and the military is back in control. It's a very young democracy. We still have democracy in the Philippines, but it sort of looks like we have a very autocratic ruler there, even though he was voted into office, right? But he has suspended many of the rights of people because he's been fighting this drug campaign and fighting terrorism in the Philippines. So obviously, there's complicated situations all around the world that they're very different. And in some places, maybe it's more understandable than others. But democracy is facing challenges, and the Chinese I think increasingly feel that that benefits them, that democracy is weakening. And China has said that its development model presents a new way, a new path for countries around the world if they want to develop, and countries look at China and they say, wow, this is an economic powerhouse. We want to know what the magic sauce is. And of course, no country can really duplicate what the Chinese have done. And let's remember, it's not just not a democracy. It really is, it's a socialist country. And it's organized around Leninism. And the role of the Communist Party is extremely important in China's development model. So whereas we do see a slide from democracy to authoritarian regimes, we haven't seen too many communist or socialist systems emerge around the world. But China really does want to, as I said, gain the respect that it is producing good governance for its people. One of the things that worries me about Xi Jinping is that when he first came to power, he said that China should participate in the reform of global governance. And that means a lot of things. It means UN-affiliated institutions. It means things like the World Bank and the IMF. It might mean other things like international law, like the law of the sea. And then he said, we not only want to participate, we want to guide global governance reform. And since June of 2018, Xi Jinping has said, we want to lead global governance reform. And I believe that leading means inserting Chinese norms, Chinese interests, and China's vision into the global governance system. And I really do find that worrisome. I think it's a threat to democracies around the world. But of course, the first thing we need to do as a country is improve our governance at home. We've got all these problems of gap between rich and poor and racism in our country. And Xi Jinping just celebrated achieving the goal of eliminating poverty in China. So yeah, there are developing countries around the world that are beginning to say, we don't really think the US is the right model for us. So until we really improve our situation at home, how can we demonstrate to the rest of the world that our model is superior to China?
So is it fair to say then, after sort of the last 4 years, people are looking at America and hearing this from China and saying, I don't want that. That kind of democracy looks like not such a great option. And by the way, China is helping us with infrastructure in a way America is not. Sure, China has human rights violations, but America does. Is that where we are now, and is that different from where we were 4 years ago?
I do think that there are more particularly poorer countries in Africa and Latin America, Central America, that think that they can model themselves or learn something from China's model. And China's giving them not only infrastructure, but also vaccines now. So, they do see China as part of the solution. Many countries are importing the surveillance equipment that Huawei and ZTE provide. And surveillance cameras can be used to control crime. Absolutely. There can be a benefit, but they can also be misused. I've been told that there have been exercises done in China where one person goes into the street and a group of people are given his or her picture, and they have to see how quickly they can locate that person and then actually find them and arrest them. So it's just like somewhere between 10 and 15 minutes it takes to just find anybody in China. To me, that's awfully scary. That's how quickly they can do it. So there are countries that are importing that kind of surveillance technology that I think that we should also be worried about. So yes, the democratic systems are not excelling except in maybe a few countries around the world. You can look at the combating the spread of COVID-19. New Zealand and Taiwan are probably very, very high on the list. They've done very, very well, and they are both democracies. But China, of course, doesn't talk about those successful democratic countries. They only talk about the ones that are failing.
So you made another really important point that I think is misunderstood in American discourse, and that is the difference between democracy, authoritarianism, and socialism. In this country, a, there are, I think, a lot of people who believe that what we might think of as more progressive or traditionally democratic norms are going to slip into socialism. I wonder if you could explain to someone who doesn't understand that distinction and says, I don't want to be socialist. You just told me, Bonnie, that, whoa, China wants us to be socialists. We need to worry about that. How do you respond to that thicket that I think gets discussed but not explained?
Well, I think first, to be fair, we have to distinguish between different kinds of socialism. Democratic socialism that is practiced in some countries. I get, you could call maybe Sweden a democratic socialist country where there's a lot of rights that people are given if they're, let's say, everybody gets health insurance. In Canada, you don't get a bill if you go to a doctor. It's just automatically paid for. I mean, some people think of that as progressive socialist policies, right? So some people would say Bernie Sanders, pushes socialism to have everybody's university education maybe paid for. I think Elizabeth Warren was pushing that for a while.
So the
So
idea that government provides a lot of,
government provides these things for free to everyone. And
right.
some people do define socialism as progressively that way. That's something I think different than what I am talking about in the case of China, which from a political science perspective is really more totalitarian society. It's a government organized and controlled from the top. But you have a communist party that is part of every aspect of life. So it exists in all of the universities and all of the private companies, as well as the state-owned companies. The party can enter your house in Xinjiang and move in, which is they're sending party members to surveil individual Uyghur families. So, I mean, the party permeates the entire society.
So you really don't have the kind of rights that we have under the Bill of Rights where you can say, government back off. That's really what the way I see the Bill of Rights. It's not something that you're born with. It's something you can enforce
right.
in courts.
And there's no checks and balances.
No type of, so what do
we
you
have a
say?
legislature, we have an independent judiciary and all of that.
So is there really a serious threat or concern around slipping from democratic socialism, where we've got government that maybe redistributes wealth, or however people want to articulate that, that is to minimize the massive income inequality, and some would say that's actually good for the economy, good for even really wealthy people. Is there a real concern, and this might be outside your expertise, but there's a concern going in that direction, and pretty soon we're like China, or we're like Cuba. A lot of Floridians voted for Donald Trump, really worried about communist socialism. And if we embrace a bigger role for government in equalizing people's quality of life, we are going to end up like China.
I guess I think that that's highly unlikely. I mean, I think all of these policy considerations or proposals need to be discussed. What should the role of government be in all of these things? One of the areas that is pertinent to China is whether we should have industrial policies. The United States hasn't had industrial policies like China has, but we have in the past tried to funnel money sometimes to create successful industries.
When you say industrial policies, can you explain what you mean by that?
So basically, the state decides in China that they want to be a leader in the world in semiconductors. And so they funnel a lot of money. They say, okay, we're going to choose these two companies we think are the best positioned. There won't be any others. We're going to funnel a lot of money to them. We're going to help bring talent from the outside into those companies. We're going to give them all this preferential treatment, and we're going to create conditions so they will become global leaders in semiconductors. That's one of
Whereas
the
here
things.
we just let the market do it.
Right. Here, that's right. We think that mostly that the market should decide. R&D in our country is increasingly, it comes from private companies. It no longer real very much of it comes from government. In China, it's like all government. So yeah, we think that capital generally is more efficiently used and more successfully used if it is determined by the market. And a lot of people are questioning whether that is completely right going forward. So it's a debate we should have. And one of the things that's, of course, great about our system is we do debate. And when we make mistakes, we beat ourselves up and we figure out why we made mistakes. That kind of thing just doesn't happen in China. When they make mistakes, they sweep them under the rug and they don't talk about them. So I think that's one of the strengths of the United States. It looks really messy and ugly from the outside, but I think the outcome is often better policy.
Yeah, so this sort of concern that we're going to end up like China, there's such a big gulf culturally, politically, in terms of the government structure. That's really not
No,
a concern, but
not a
there are
concern.
some shifts that probably need to happen. And I know we're almost out of time. I want to thank. This is so fascinating. But a couple of last questions. One is you mentioned, okay, there's a lockdown on information on the internet, or a lot of it gets filtered. But I've also read that China kind of let that horse out of the barn a little bit, and the Chinese have more information that maybe now they wish they had. And I guess my question is, do you see just how, the digital age and big data and all that is changing our government, our society? Is that putting pressure on China? Is that a sort of beacon of light potentially in this kind of need to control their population going forward?
When the internet first started, there was a hope that it wouldn't be easy to control and it would introduce new ideas into China, that people would be able to talk about things in ways that had been more difficult for them to do in the past. And a lot of people wrote that it would lead to greater democracy in China. And I think that has proven totally wrong. I think the Chinese have shown an uncanny, unexpected ability to control the spread of information, and they use advanced technology to do it. So even they have the most popular app of WeChat. There will be certain phrases that if people enter into them, they will just be blocked, or they won't be able to post something. Or if they put something up that is seen as potentially against Chinese rules, somebody will come knocking at your door. And you might be investigated. You might be called for tea. That is the word when the public, the police come and question you, or the intelligence officials, or you might just get arrested. And
That's fascinating.
increasingly, people live in fear.
Because of the digital
Yes.
surveillance, which I think a lot of people worry about in the United States. At the same time, people worry about the misinformation that's trashing democracy in the United States too. Where's that balance between controlling information but not doing this kind of lockdown? Maybe there's something that Americans can learn from the Chinese, but certainly not in the way that you're describing. That's very terrifying, but that's partially the digital age. So what's going to happen, do you think, with the Uyghurs and this genocide? Can America, just quick last minute questions? Can America do anything about the genocide and the Uyghurs? Is there any meaningful policy that we can impose to stop that?
It's very difficult to influence Chinese policies within its own borders. There is some discussion underway as to whether or not the United States should try to encourage countries to boycott the 2022 Olympics in Beijing, because this is a lever that the world might be able to use to get the Chinese to release the Uyghurs. I'm doubtful that many countries would be willing to boycott. Maybe major countries won't send their leaders to opening and closing ceremonies. Maybe we will discourage our companies and from advertising in the Olympics and becoming sponsors. Maybe some athletes will even choose not to go, or while they are there, maybe they will make public statements about what is happening in Xinjiang. There's a range of things we could do around the Olympics. I think a boycott might be difficult, but some people are thinking about these things.
What about the Trump trade wars? Is there any leverage there? Was that successful? If you could explain what that even was for our viewers.
Oh, well, that would be a big topic. The Trump administration started out wanting to negotiate with China on a broad number of things, problems between the US and China in the trade realm. But after months of negotiation, we came up with an agreement, and it went to what's called the highest level of the decision makers in China. It's called the Politburo Standing Committee, and it was rejected. And so they went back to the drawing board and they decided it's too hard to do a big agreement. Let's just do a small one. So they called it the Phase 1 agreement. And the core part of that agreement is what President Trump wanted, that China should just buy more American products and narrow our bilateral trade deficit. And the high level of the quantity of goods that the Chinese committed to buy was, most people believe, unachievable. And then COVID-19 hit. So it's like they just cannot buy all of the soybeans and LNG. And so we've just said, as an administration, the Biden administration here, the United States has said that we're going to hold them to that. We're going to make them purchase everything. I don't know how we're going to do that. But the real question is, are we going to go back to the original set of issues that we didn't achieve in that Phase 1 deal? And they include things like subsidies that China gives to its companies to make them national champions, to favor them over foreign companies, opening up China's market more for foreign companies, and basically providing a fair playing field so that American companies can compete in China alongside of other companies. And protection of intellectual property rights also, still remains a very important issue. So these are the things that I think they want to get back to, and maybe we will see new trade negotiations. Maybe we will see a better deal. But the bottom line is that under Xi Jinping, the Chinese are talking more and more about self-reliance, about developing their own technology, being less reliant on other countries, and taking the lead. So they want to displace the United States and other leading countries in the world, and they want to be the leaders themselves in 21st century technologies. And
so
that's a threat.
Yeah, so let me ask you, that's the follow-up question. Because what I tell my students is it's the why that's more important even than the what. So, and there's almost nothing too basic to, I think, to explain necessarily, which is, why is it so bad if China steals our intellectual property, isn't interested in trade? Why does that affect regular people in America going about their business that don't think a whole lot about China? Why should people care?
Well, I think we should care about our country being strong. If we're not strong, we can't defend our interests, either at home or around the world. We have to be able to be innovative. That builds our economy. We won't have a great economy and a strong US dollar if we're not doing well in the world. What if countries around the world start to look to China as the leader instead of the United States and accommodate to Chinese interests? And they like the idea, or maybe just defer to China's vision of having an international order based on Chinese definitions of human rights, Chinese definitions of what the internet should look like. I don't think that many democratic countries really want to live in that kind of a world. And I don't think Americans would. I can tell you that the 23.5 million people who live in Taiwan, and again, China claims Taiwan, it's a very vibrant democracy. They don't want to be exposed to China's norms and China's vision for the world. They are more interested in the democratic vision. And so I think Americans like to be able to say what they want. They don't want government listening in on them. They want to have privacy. There's no such thing as, there's no word for privacy in Chinese. They had to make one up because it didn't exist in their history, in their culture. There was no privacy. So I think, ultimately we want to just preserve our way of life. And go about our business of being, raucous, independent, opinionated people. And you can't do that in China. So
it sounds like you're saying that is not to be taken for granted, that we're always going to have that.
yep.
And then the second thing is almost like what you're saying is on the world stage, if you're walk into a meeting and there are people around, right now people perk up with the Americans at the table, and we want to retain that gravitas, that seat at the table, and not cede it to China. We've all had those experiences in life where all of a sudden we're not noticed. And then other settings we are noticed. And on the global stage, that does have a huge impact in not only our futures, but our children's and our grandchildren in terms of the kind of lives we can have as Americans in sharing this planet.
Very well said.
This is so interesting, Bonnie. I cannot thank you enough. I learned a lot, and we broke down so many wonderful things that I think people will really get a lot out of. So I want thank you so much for being on Simple Politics tonight.
Thank you for having me.
This is really great. I really learned so much.